You're listening to Idea Collider, a show that explores the world of asymmetric learning. On this show, I will sit down with pharmaceutical experts and business leaders to discuss how to embrace uncertainty and the different learning style that follows. I'm your host, Mike Greer. Let's get into the show. Welcome to Idea Collider. I'm so delighted to have someone that I've followed for a long time now in the industry, Susan Galbraith from AstraZeneca. Susan, you've had an extraordinary career from training in medicine at Manchester and Cambridge to leading oncology R&D at AstraZeneca, where you brought 13 new cancer medicines to patients. Can you share maybe a pivotal moment in your journey that shaped your passion for oncology and innovation?
Sure. Obviously, I would just say that at the start that I didn't necessarily plan to be here at the beginning of my career. My goal was to train in medicine, and I was very excited to do that. And then my choice of what kind of doctor I wanted to be changed in the early years post-qualification. So initially, I thought I wanted to be a cardiologist, and then I ended up doing an oncology stint as part of one of the rotations I did at Addenbrooke's Hospital. And that's really when I fell in love with the science behind oncology, decided that's how I wanted to spend my time. So that was early on in my junior years as a hospital doctor. And then when I was partway through my registrar training as a clinical oncologist, I decided I wanted to do a PhD. And I ended up doing a PhD at Mount Vernon Hospital and Gray Laboratory on a compound that subsequently got licensed in by a pharmaceutical company.
Okay.
And so I've been involved in both lab-based in vitro, in vivo work, and then the phase 1 trial design for this program. And so at the time that was then being licensed, which was just towards the end of my PhD, after I presented some of the phase 1 data, I got asked if I was interested in a role in the pharmaceutical company, which is Bristol Myers Squibb. And I hadn't really thought about it at that point, but I went and visited, and I was interested in that, and then took that opportunity post my PhD and moved across the Atlantic. Husband gave up his job, and we took two small children across the Atlantic, and I joined the pharmaceutical industry. So that was how I ended up. And I thought I'd be doing it for a couple of years and then go back. And here I am, long time later.
Okay. Many years later. Have you been in the States ever since?
No, I had 9 years in the States with Bristol Myers Squibb. And then when I got the job at AstraZeneca, I moved back to the UK at that point.
Fantastic. Look, I talked about how transformational AstraZeneca has been in oncology. You've clearly blockbusters like Tagrisso, halving death rates in early stage lung cancer. It's one of the hottest areas in the industry at the moment, has been for a while. How do you define success in R&D, especially in oncology?
I think the first thing is to set a vision for what you want to achieve. And our long-term evergreen vision is that we want to eliminate cancer as a cause of death. So that's very high level. But it's also important then to set achievable steps along the pathway to that in both the nearer term and then the long term, sort of 10-year kind of view. So what we're targeting is tangible improvements in 5-year survival outcomes in key tumor types, lung cancer, breast cancer, etc. And also, then you've also got nearer term goals along the way with the number of patients that you can actually treat with an AstraZeneca medicine. And so those are how we frame the overall ambition. And I guess the successes along the way are also fundamentally measured by the impact that you have on a patient's lives. And so it's been a constant source of motivation to actually hear patient stories from patients who've been participants in the clinical trials who have subsequently received one or other of the medicines. And you hear those stories, and that's what continues to give you motivation, because actually drug discovery and development it's a hard business, and there's often failures along the way. Failure is actually a fundamental part of the scientific process. And so you have to accept that. But those stories are strong motivation. And I think the other core motivating factor is the fact you get to work with an incredibly bright bunch of people from a diverse set of backgrounds globally, both within AstraZeneca, but also outside in terms of the investigators that we work with, the sites that we get to participate with. And so those interactions are also very stimulating and highly motivating it's a long-term time period to actually get to those goals. And there are many hurdles along the way where things don't always work out the way that you'd hoped.
Yeah, which is it's kind of interesting because oncology is one of those sort of classic things where, as you say, I mean, realistically, we can talk about 5-10 year survival now, where 20 years ago that was much a long way out. How do you on the way? Like, how can you tell quickly with a drug in early phase that you're on the right path?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And but it's really about seeing the signals early on that you've got something that is different from the norm. So if I go back to the early days with osimertinib Tagrisso, this is a program that we knew was specifically designed to address the T790M mutation that was happening as a resistance mutation that occurred towards the first generation EGFR inhibitors. And so at the time that we started the phase 1 trial for osimertinib, we had a test available, but the first few cohorts, we didn't select patients purely on a T790M, but we knew that it was roughly about 50% of patients that had prior exposure to an EGFR first generation inhibitor that would have that. And so in the first cohort of patients, we saw 2 responses out of 4 patients, and that was at the first dose level. At that point, I knew that we had something special. Now, of course, I didn't know that it was going to translate through to the data that you just quoted for ADAURA, but that was different enough from standard phase 1 experience to know that it's likely to be something better. So it happened at a relatively low exposure, and it happened early on in roughly the proportion that we expected to be T790M positive. So I think you can get a feel over time. Obviously, to have robust decision making, you need a lot more data than 4 patients worth of data. But it's that sense. And really, it's about talking to investigators, because although practicing clinical oncologist for 10 years, I no longer put my hands directly on patients that are involved in the clinical trials, and speaking directly to investigators about what their experience is. You get a sense of the qualitative, what the drug is doing from them, that is harder to put into the standard tables and listings that you get from a clinical trial. And so I think that's really important. I do hope that some of the new technologies that are being developed will help us get a more quantitative sense of that feel. So this idea of digital twins, where you matched patients who are enrolled in the clinical trials for digital version based on the genomic data, the clinical data, the pathology data, the imaging data. I think that's an intriguing idea. See whether or not you'll get that same improved level of prediction from that. But at the moment, years of experience is not a substitute for the data. But you obviously have to analyze the data in depth as well. Put those 2 things together, and I think that's really important.
I was kind of interested in the kind of art that you described, because it's true in every therapy area, is looking at the early data. Typically, you're looking between the lines at what's being seen and using some human intuition and judgment as well as the kind of raw stats, because otherwise it would all just get too hard to take a program forward in many cases. Do you find that your sort of your practicing oncology experience is useful when you're talking to people like about what you're seeing?
I absolutely think that having seen a large number of patients during the time in practice and seeing a large number of clinical trials is a really important part of the judgment process. So what I always encourage physicians and scientists within our early oncology team to do is have this iterative, dynamic conversations with the investigators that are involved in the clinical trials, because that give you that judgment piece, in addition to very careful data curation and benchmarking versus the data that we've previously got from other clinical trials that have been reported.
Yeah. And that kind of patient centricity that you described as well, as sort of understanding what the patients want beyond raw survival data, which clearly sounds like an attractive goal, but for many patients, the journey on the way is at least as important. Are you going to see any of that mirrored in the digital twin kind of investigation as well?
Again, that's a really good question. I do think that sense of what patients are actually experiencing is also something that's important. And I think some of the digital health technologies can help get a sense of that. I've often felt that the CTC adverse event criteria, useful as they are, because they're standard benchmark that you can look at. If you look at things that got grade 2 toxicity on the CTC AE criteria, for example, particularly GI side effects in particular, grade 2 diarrhea may sound like it's low grade, but if that means that you're having to go to the bathroom 5 times a day and having to plan your trips out, that isn't a small impact on people's lifestyle. And if that happens for 2 days out of a 6-month period on a program. That is probably entirely manageable. But it happens every day for continuously. That's a very different experience. And so this kind of area under the curve of the experience of a patient from an adverse event perspective, I think is very important. And some of the digital health tools, I think, can help us more easily gather data that is richer in terms of data sets for the actual adverse events that people are experiencing. And so we have our digital health team has now formed a company called Evernova, which is wholly owned by AstraZeneca. And they are developing those kinds of patient response and also remote patient monitoring tools, which I think are really important in capturing that patient experience of what it's like to be on one of the medicines, what it's like to be on one of the trials. And I think that's really, really important.
Yeah, and you guys were one of the first you still are the first to spin a company out in that way. How do you kind of look at what's possible in 2025 and beyond, given you must get 50 emails a day from different providers of technologies, that sort of sense of what's possible? How do you keep abreast of that?
Well, I think, again, you've got teams within the overall oncology R&D team that have their own accountabilities. And I think by creating this global health tech business that is Evernova, it gives a team that are very specialized. They've got people that have the expertise in understanding patient experiences of devices and how to create something that is easier to use. So, for example, they have a unify system so that you can have many different digital tools that can be addressed through one application and one single sign-on. Better for sites, better for patients, simpler. And then they've invested also in some training methodologies. It's not within oncology, but for things like spirometry training, which can be a great limiting step in terms of diagnosis of COPD and asthma. That's another example. So I think it's about having people with the depth of experience as part of the overall team, but then enable them to focus on what they do well, but then coordinate with the rest of the team. So this theme of modularity with coordination, which enables you to embed these advances at scale and scale across the breadth of the oncology team.
Yes, interesting. And clearly some of that is cultural as well. So that kind of culture of continuous learning. The podcast focuses on the idea of asymmetric learning. So what are you guys learning faster than anyone else in the space? How do you and AstraZeneca foster that culture of continuous learning?
There's a few things that are really important here. One is that, as I've said at the beginning, failures are an inevitable part of the scientific process. And so the understanding that things that you try are worth trying and not everything's going to succeed. And the key thing is that you're taking your learning from the things that haven't succeeded. Did they nearly succeed? And they missed for some reason or another? If so, is that something that's applicable to the next program or the next way that we do that? And how can we make sure that we do it better? How do you do it a little bit better based on that experience? I think that's one important piece. The second thing is that in a large organization, allowing the different groups to grow and develop and have their own focus, I think that's important as well. So if you think about how we're structured, we've got 2 big R&D strategic hubs in the United States, in Boston and in Gaithersburg. We've got 2 big R&D hubs as a company in Europe, in Cambridge, UK, and in Gothenburg. And now we've got 2 strategic hubs in Asia with the Shanghai and Beijing. So each of those groups have their own network. Now we have networks of sites that we work with. We have a partners choice network that's focused very much on the early phase 1 studies that we have choose with depth of experience in translational research. And we also have a partners in care network that is important for our phase 2 and phase 3 programs, sites that we repeatedly go to with a breadth of the portfolio that we have in breast cancer and lung cancer. So these networks that we create tap into the external knowledge network and help us to feed in. And the fact that we are geographically spread across the world enables us to make sure that we're learning from the best science that's happening in China and in Japan, the best science that's happening in Europe, and the best science that's happening in the United States and North America. There's this tapping into that network. There's the acceptance of failure. It's the allowing groups to specialize, but then coordinate and share it learnings across the organization. I think that's really important. And then there's another element that we're doing at the moment where everybody is having to learn about AI, all of us, myself included. And that's really about creating a culture where we're willing to take a bit of risk, dive in. And I'm using the term play. I want people to play with the latest tools that are available for AI and then come back and say, okay, so what's working? What have you found useful? Why have you found it useful?
Nice.
What else would you want for it to be maximally useful to you? So I think that's a really important way of rapidly adopting a new technology. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge, because it's a huge challenge and a huge opportunity, because I do think that the AI systems can substantially change, radically change how we do many aspects of discovery and development across the organization.
Absolutely. Changes in AI every week when you start using it. You look at it and it's suddenly got better. Even reading your own history on Twitter, for example, it's remarkable. Do you see changes across those kind of hubs? Do you feel a kind of intensity from China, or do you see that pretty much spread across the different sites?
So each group, again, has their own, if you like, elements of the culture that's reflective of the country in which they are located and the mix of people that we've got. We aim to get a diverse set of backgrounds of people at all of the sites that we're working in. One of the things we've been doing with R&D China and actually R&D Japan is having a number of short-term secondments both ways, people in the US or UK out to one of their sites or back the other way. And I think that's been really helpful in making sure that ideas, people connections flow better across the breadth of the organization. I would say that if you look at the total environment, though, that the pace of change overall in China in the bioscience space is extraordinarily rapid. I mean, I've been traveling to China for over 20 years, my career, apart from the COVID years.
Mm-hmm.
It's remarkable how much things have changed in that time period, and the pace of acceleration of innovation. And of course, there are some areas like cell therapy where, because the China regulatory authorities have allowed these investigator-initiated studies, I think there are multiple Chinese-based biotechs and sites that have gained rapidly clinical experience with cell therapies that's incredibly informative as to the next iterations. So that's one of the reasons why we're continue to be invested in China and continue to build the capability that we have of our R&D group in China, such that they're now capable of leading global pivotal trials as well as global phase 1 trials. So I think that's a really important part of making sure that we are moving rapidly in China, but also spreading the learning about how we're doing that across the rest of the organization.
Nice. I wasn't planning on asking this, but I'd be interested in, because the mood music from the FDA is clearly more openness to IITs and so forth. Do you think that there is opportunity in the States for changes in the way that regulations are applied to phase 1, phase 2 and launch that can make a difference?
Well, I do think that for technologies that include the sort of cell and gene therapy field, that it's hard to get preclinical models that are predictive of what you're going to then experience. So I think inevitably, as a result of that's what's driven some of the regulatory flexibility in allowing small-scale human-based trials to learn as quickly as possible. And it has been shown that you can do that safely with the appropriate guardrails around that. That does foster this iterative learning loop very quickly, which enables the technology to move rapidly. So I think it is a model that's worth being considered, by regulatory authorities elsewhere as well. And I'd certainly support that. But there are learnings that have come from that experience as well about what are the guardrails that are needed in place, what's the sizing, how much goes in the way that is safe for the patients that are going to enroll in those trials.
Yeah, of course. If I was going to come back to some precision oncology, where Tagrisso is a great example, what kind of emerging technologies or data-driven approaches can we be looking towards for the sort of next generation of personalized cancer therapies? And for where something like Enhertu clearly is going beyond where we thought Enhertu would initially go. So personalized still comes with it, quotation marks. But what do you see as the kind of opportunity for personalized medicine maybe over the next 10, 15 years?
Well, there's lots of opportunity to build on what we've already gained. So I think one thing that is clearly an area that can help here is moving from, I call the 19th century technology of looking down a microscope and looking at, in a semi-quantitative way, at cell surface expression through immunohistochemistry, and moving that to a digital and computational pathology platform is a huge area of opportunity. So delighted that we've got the opportunity to push that with the first computational pathology biomarker that we're developing in the context of the TROP2 antibody drug conjugate, datopotamab deruxtecan, or Dato-DXd. So it is clear that we're right for change in that space, but also making that change at scale globally is also something that is going to take effort to help drive. Now, we have done that with what were novel technologies before. We did it with circulating tumor DNA for FR mutations. We've done it in collaboration with companies like Myriad and other diagnostic companies for BRCA mutation testing, and then HRD testing and multiplexed HRR mutation testing. So I think it is absolutely doable, but it will be a big effort. And we've already started working with a number of sites and companies like Ventana. We have a collaboration with for that computational pathology to help deliver it at scale. But we're going to need to do that at scale globally. And that's important. What's really interesting now is that AI applied to pathology imaging is advancing at pace. And you say almost every week, there's a new model that is coming out where you can actually just take H&E slides, so no staining at all, and have a reasonably high level of confidence in the prediction about whether a patient may have a mutation like an EGFR mutation or a HER2 overexpression just from the H&E. And to begin with, my reaction to that was, we've got a perfectly good, highly sensitive and specific EGFR mutation test. Why would you want that? Well, the reason why you want that is still too many patients don't get tested. Yeah. And they just get put on the alternative therapy in the absence of testing. And that can still affect 15, 20, 30% of patients in some countries. And so by being able to identify patients that are very likely to have one of these actionable mutations in lung cancer, for example, or possibly a BRCA mutation in another disease, is actually very helpful to be able to flag. And so these digital pathology tools and AI-based models applied to those tools are going to revolutionize, I think, the way in which we do the diagnostic funnel, if you like. I also think that what's going to happen is that patients will have the opportunity to be diagnosed with cancer at an earlier stage, because there continue to be advances in the sensitivity and specificity of blood-based testing using either circulating tumor DNA or other technologies that are approaching. And I think that's a very exciting opportunity, because we know that if we intervene earlier in the stage of this disease, we can have more transformative outcomes and more treatment options. So I think the world of diagnosis is going to get revolutionized by a number of these technologies that are going to come. We're going to then have multimodal prediction models, which will take some of the clues from the patient symptom history in the electronic healthcare record, together with the appearances on a pathology image, together with the appearances on the scanning, and be able to identify at an earlier point what the optimal treatment strategy will be. I also think we just need to reflect that as some of these diseases that we have called one disease, like non-small cell lung cancer, and that we've realized that those are segmented, that as different treatments come through for more and more differently identified patient subgroups, that the community oncologist that may be treating that patient is going to need help navigating all of those options available. And I think that's another important piece of where technology can help provide, based on the guidelines that organizations like the NCCN and others create, a guideline associated navigation of what is going to become a more diverse set of options for patients will be really important as well.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because that idea is of the industry, really, the industries, I guess, the diagnostic and the pharmaceutical industries are really going to be driving changes in the medical landscape as much as the other way around. I mean, I guess that's the reality, as you say, sort of cancer is not going to be cancer in an easy kind of description in 10 years' time. I wanted to touch on the thing that you talked about with sort of collaborations and sort of external partnerships. I know you've got collaborations with Cancer Research UK, ICR. You've got examples of those partnerships which have really led to a breakthrough internally and been successful?
Drug discovery and development is always a team-based effort, and often the collaborations that make up that team extend outside of an individual company. So there are a couple of examples that are tangible examples within our pipeline. Of course, olaparib, which AstraZeneca acquired, Kudos Pharmaceuticals, a small biotech that was based in Cambridge, UK, and we acquired olaparib as part of that. But what Kudos had done was work with investigators at the Institute of Cancer Research, people like Andrew Tutt and Johan de Bono, who were involved in the early phase clinical trials with this drug, and also linking data to translational work. And that's helped us better understand which are the right patients to treat in different settings of breast cancer, prostate cancer, etc. And many of those collaborations on the science have been invaluable in understanding how we further design elements of the development. I think the development of capivasertib is another example of collaborations, as the AKT inhibitor, which is approved in second-line hormone receptor-positive breast cancer in a subsegment of patients that have got AKT or PIK3CA mutations. So those are examples where actually right from the beginning, there was collaborative work understanding how to target AKT, and that work ultimately led to the subsequent discovery of capivasertib and the development of that with the discovery chemistry. So there was multiple examples of that. But I think all of the drugs that we've got, I mean, if you look at Tagrisso, the insights on the T790M mutation were coming from collaborations that we had with sites in Asia, where that T790M mutation was seen, as well as there were descriptions in the literature. So the idea about having something that could be an improvement on the first generation EGFR inhibitors essentially was born out of, first of all, the work that we had done internally with ERASA, but also the extensive conversations we were having with investigators around the world. And because we had worked and got ERASA into sites in Japan and South Korea and China, we got some of those insights early on. So I think every drug that we have in the portfolio, you can point to places where there's been insights or additions that have come from external collaborations. And that's why these relationships are so important and so key, that you have to maintain over years in order to gain the benefits from.
Yeah, and that kind of two-way, I guess, receptivity is probably a differentiator for AstraZeneca, because a lot of companies clearly have similar relationships that might not be listening quite as hard as you are. Wanted to, aware of time's going to run away from us quite quickly, but you published recently in Contemporary Clinical Trials about your approach to diversity in your US oncology trials.
Yeah.
What kind of practical steps have you implemented to ensure equitable representation in studies and improve clinical trial outcomes?
Well, and I would just say, first of all, this is a work in progress, because I think there's more that we need to do. I still think that around the world, we have work to do to increase the proportion of patients that are diagnosed with cancer that have the opportunity to participate in clinical trials or find that an attractive option.
Yep.
But in particular, we have put in place diversity action plans in terms of making sure that we state what our enrollment goals are. Our aim is to, including clinical trials, a representation of the populations we ultimately want to treat in the countries that we're then going to launch the medicines. And obviously, patients who are in the lower socioeconomic groups often struggle with some of the inevitable burden that there is about participation in clinical trials. So it's important to think about that. And often distance from a clinical trial site is one important factor that's important there. So by increasing the proportion of community-based sites within the United States, that's one key thing that we're doing. And also that means that investment in training of community oncologists in terms of what they need to do to participate effectively in the clinical trials is important. We've also got partnerships with patient advocacy groups that can increase education and awareness of what clinical trials are, what it means and it entails, so that patients who can thinking about whether it's something that's relevant for them can hear from people in their own communities about what their experience has been and why it might be a good idea to participate in a clinical trial. We're also working with direct patient recruitment vendors that enable us to reach out to patients directly so that they can understand what's available in the portfolio of clinical trials for their particular disease. And of course, we also think about how we can help provide some support for the barriers, to overcome those barriers to enrollment about travel and the costs associated with it, because it is a time burden on patients to participate in a clinical trial. And that is time away from caring from people that they were responsible for caring for at home, or time away from employment. And those are often the important parts of the barriers to participate.
Fantastic. Actually, Mene was probably my first guest on this podcast, but way back when we discussed the 5 R's. But you published about the 6R framework recently on digital health and clinical trials. I mean, you talked a little bit about how those digital tools are transforming trials. Coming back to some of those barriers to uptake, what kind of barriers do you see to scaling those technologies globally?
Again, if you can do some of the testing or data collection that's required for clinical trials at home through digital remote devices, that can just reduce the number of visits, and actually has the benefit not just of being more patient-centric, if you like, it also reduces the carbon footprints associated with clinical trials, which is also something that we're measuring and trying to improve. So I do think that the use of these digital platforms, chatbots, so that they can help explain some of the information and support to patients, working towards going to electronic consent rather than too difficult to read, long informed consent forms, for example. You can send reminders, you can help people set up what their diaries need to be. And then we also need to make sure that the technologies that we are developing are relatively easy to use, because obviously cancer patients tend to be older. So you've got to make sure that it's applicable to that patient population, age group that we're hoping to recruit into the clinical trials.
Yeah. And just looping that into the AI thing, I mean, clearly the ethical considerations of AI in clinical research are a really big part of where everyone's worries sit. How do you think about AI as far as clinical research goes?
Well, first of all, I think there's huge opportunity from the use of AI actually to remove some of the manual tasks that are costly and burdensome for sites, as well as for people that are doing some of the jobs within the industry as well. So I think there's a huge opportunity to do that. I also think that AI tools can help us with our decision-making and design of clinical trials and help make those more effective. And that could be a big plus. In the context of what you're saying, though, in terms of the ethical principles, we have principles that we've set out that AI needs to be explainable and transparent, that it has to be fair, that got inherent biases that are built into that, as human-centric as possible. And in the context of the goal for the use of AI has to be socially beneficial. And of course, the privacy and security aspect of this is also something that is important. But we've got systems where we've been used to using for anonymizing patient data, making sure that is appropriately done across all of the systems that we've got. So I think there are ways in which we can leverage the significant benefits that I think that AI can apply to the clinical trial process and clinical development process, while safeguarding some of those principles that are embedded into how we do clinical trials.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, you personally have been known for mentoring young female scientists and championing diversity at AstraZeneca. What kind of advice would you have for early career researchers, especially women, in navigating the world of oncology R&D?
Thank you. I would just say, first of all, that I've benefited in my career from mentorship at different key points in my trajectory. And so I very much feel that it's both a fun thing to do, a rewarding thing to do, but also an important and necessary thing to do to actually contribute to the development of the next generation researchers. And so looking back, I think there's 3 key things that I would say. First of all, you have to be open to opportunities. Not everything is going to go completely your way. I mean, there has been several examples in my career where I failed to get what I thought I wanted at the time. And in each case, another opportunity has come along. So one door closes, another opens. And actually, when you look back, some of those opportunities have enabled subsequent success. So be open to the opportunities that will come across. And whenever something happens that you're disappointed about, look for what the opportunity is, the other side of that. The second thing is don't self-limit. It's very easy to say, I could never do that. I would rephrase that and say, what are the skill sets and experiences that you would need in order to be a really good candidate to do that job? And then what can you do to make sure that you're gaining those skill sets and experience along the way in order to make you a good candidate for that role? And then the third thing I would is stay curious. Being open-minded as to what might pull you in and interest you is something that is really important. So stay curious and then build and use your network of people. Don't imagine that you're going to solve all of the problems single-handedly. Nobody is. This is a team-based endeavor. And so if you build your network and leverage, that will pay dividends over your lifetime. It'll also bring you joy along the way.
Yeah, I'm interested in one, just to go back to one of those examples, if you like, of something that's gone wrong and then you found a way to pivot. Clearly, oncology R&D is laden with uncertainty, but could you share a time when some significant setback led to, in your approach, helped you navigate through that?
Well, there's a couple of them. When I first joined the industry with BMS, I talked about that. I'd worked for 4 or 5 years on this program for this drug that's then Bristol Myers Squibb had licensed. By the time I ended up in my first job at BMS, 2 weeks after I arrived, they killed that drug that I'd worked on for 4 or 5 years. At that point, I was deeply disappointed. Had the opportunity to head back across the Atlantic. I might have taken it, but it's a lesson in my boats felt like they were burnt. And so I had to find something else to do. What I ended up finding to do was starting to learn about cancer immunology, which I didn't know much about at the time and was heavily skeptical about. And out of that came the opportunity. So I went to a small conference in New York and saw some phase 1 data that the Medirex team were presenting on this drug that subsequently became ipilimumab. And I went back from that conference and spoke to the business development team at BMS, and that led to subsequently the in-licensing of ipilimumab and a whole journey of cancer immunology that I might not have been able to play a role in had I had the killing prematurely, perhaps, of the drug that I had worked on for so long. So that's what I mean by, one door closes and another one opens.
What a great door. I worked on the launch of Nivo globally, and we were encountering skepticism even at the launch post-Yervoy of when Nivo was coming through. Still skepticism about what was going to happen to that class. And now you look at the world's biggest drug with Keytruda, it's what a few years we've had there. But looking ahead in oncology, which is not easy, what do you see in terms of challenges for the field?
There's plenty of challenges every day about things that might not work or might not go wrong. I'm more optimistic than I have been at any point in my career about the fact that we're likely to be able to make a really fundamental difference in outcomes for cancer if you look forward over the next 10 years. So whilst I am absolutely sure that not everything that we're working on is going to work, and when things don't, that I'll be disappointed, what I am confident is that the trajectory is going to remain something where we can make those differences by really helping to build with the latest technologies, regimens that have different components. You might put, say, an antibody drug conjugate together with an IO-directed drug or a T-cell engager and move those into the earlier stages of disease where you can make the biggest difference, and also have more diagnostics available to better target those at the right patients, but also at an earlier stage of the disease. You take all that together, I think the opportunity to make a really big difference in those 5 and 10-year survival outcomes is really large. And that's what keeps me going every day.
And it's not an uncompetitive environment. You guys are leading the field, but everyone wants to be where you are. How do you stay ahead as a company? Is it top down? Is it bottom up? Or is it a lot more?
Well, as I said a few times already, this is a team-based effort. And I am incredibly proud of the team that we have here at AstraZeneca. And so getting the right people into the key roles across the organization is a really important part of that success, because it's the team. I mean, it's not me by any means. It's that leveraged large group of highly committed, talented individuals in the environment. So team is one thing. Creating that environment in which it's possible then for those people to do their best work and to make the difference and enable agile decision-making. That is key. And again, it's a constant work in progress about how we further improve how we're doing that. But I think we have made substantial improvements in the quality and speed of those decisions during the time period that I've had the pleasure of working at AstraZeneca. So I think that is important. Building those networks is important. There's a degree of persistence that's needed as well. You can't be doing the hokey cokey. You can't be in and out of an area. If you're going to be in an area of a technology like antibody drug conjugates or cell therapy, you've got to commit. And then, as Pascal would say, you've got to play to win in that space. And that really means seriously that you're going to take the opportunities that are there and you're going to pursue them the best. So it is a combination of these different elements together, the integration of all of that is key to success. And that's a constant challenge. And we're not by any means the best at all of those things. But if you can pull them together and consistently work at how you can get better at doing those different elements of that's what's important for longer term success.
And you and Pascal have had an incredible ride over 10, 15 years. To look back 10 years to where Pascal was next to keeping the company at the top of its game. I don't think everyone believed him, but then you look 10 years later and this constant track record of success, especially in your area, it's been quietly confident, I guess, internally rather than shouting from the rooftops.
So Pascal is a very inspiring leader. He's also constantly pushing on, as I've said, all of those different elements in terms of the quality of the team, the quality of the decision-making framework, the ability to move at pace. So it's, again, the other thing I would say is that the senior executive team at AstraZeneca is one that is also a pleasure to work with, very demanding, high-performing, but very rewarding to be part of that and to learn. I've learned an absolutely huge amount in the time period that I've been here at AstraZeneca. I've been constantly stretched and challenged. And that's also part of the thing that keeps you there because you're constantly learning.
Yeah. And I've run out of time with you, but maybe just let's close on a call to action. So for our audience, whether they're researchers, clinicians, industry leaders, what's one action that they could take today to contribute to the kind of collaborative, patient-focused innovation that you champion at AstraZeneca?
I really think that connection and coordination with the patients and investigators that are out there, they're the source of understanding of what this cancer biology is about and the source of understanding about how we can make the biggest difference to that. So human knowledge and progress is made through those connections and that collaboration. That's always been the history and that will always be true.
Fantastic. Look, Susan, thank you so much. This has been wonderful to hear your thoughts on how you've got to where you are and how AstraZeneca's got to where it is. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it.
That's it for this week's episode of Idea Collider. To continue the conversation, visit our website at ideapharma.com. Follow us in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcast. Until next time, I'm Mike Rea, wishing you great success.